Is anyone surprised that the biggest movie of the year also has the most Easter eggs and hidden details? There are still loads of subtle references in Avengers Endgame that most moviegoers missed. This video is going to point out even more secrets of Endgame, and just like our other videos in the series, there's going to be plenty of spoilers ahead. Number 1. Elderly Steve Rogers comic origins. The final major twist of Avengers Endgame involves Chris Evans' Steve Rogers traveling back in time to return the Infinity Stones. However, things don't go according to plan when Captain America doesn't return to the present day immediately. Instead, an elderly Steve Rogers is waiting on a bench nearby. He describes to Anthony Mackie's Falcon how he decided to live out his life with Peggy Carter in the past before passing on his shield to Sam Wilson. It's an incredibly emotional moment, even if the directors of the movie have had to explain how this scene is possible under Endgame's time travel rules. However, the idea of an aged Steve Rogers isn't an MCU original, and the concept has popped up a few times in the Marvel Comics. The Sam Wilson Captain America comic series centers on an aged and weakened Steve Rogers passing on the Captain America mantle to Sam Wilson. Even in his advanced age though, Rogers still acts as a leading figure and organizes other heroes in their efforts to defeat reality-bending villains. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Steve Rogers will return to the franchise anytime soon. This is still a terrific send-off for the character though, and clearly inspired by the comic book source material. Number 2. Hints about Captain Britain. While nabbing the Space Stone and Pym particles in a 1970s SHIELD base, Steve Rogers briefly overhears his love interest, Haley Atwell's Peggy Carter. While the scene mostly focuses on Rogers' emotional reaction to nearly reuniting with the woman he loves, there's a subtle bit of interesting dialogue too. Before focusing on Captain America, we briefly hear Agent Carter question why her team has yet to hear from Agent Braddock. This could very easily be a subtle reference to the Marvel character Brian Braddock, better known as the superhero alias Captain Britain. A rather strange character, even for superhero comics, Captain Britain was basically the UK equivalent of Captain America, with powers granted to him by the wizard Merlin and a specific mission to uphold the laws of Britain. The character only appeared in the British comic market for several years. Although Captain Britain is basically lifting Captain America's look, his powers are more in line with Superman's. Britain can fly, has super strength, has incredible durability, and moves impossibly fast. The magical nature of his powers also lets him detect and dispel various kinds of magic. There's no word yet if this reference means that a Captain Britain film is in the works, but we can certainly hope that it is. Now that the Infinity Saga is over, it would be great if the MCU went in some bolder and stranger directions. Number 3. The posing reference. While trying to recover the Infinity Stones from the Battle of New York, Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man and Paul Rudd's Ant-Man witness the moment Loki surrenders to the Avengers. As the past heroes capture Loki, 2012's Tony Stark makes a comment about how they need to stop posing as they still have work to do. This is a really fun acknowledgement of just how many poster shot moments were in the first Avengers movie, and how many are still in the MCU crossover films. Seriously, looking back, it's almost ridiculous how much of the first Avengers movie went to making the heroes look cool. In nearly every shot that has them all together, they're posed in a way that makes them look like the pinnacle of squad goals. Of course, there's no shortage of this posing in other ensemble cast Marvel movies either. Avengers Age of Ultron had a number of action sequences that made our heroes look like unrivaled badasses. In fact, the entire last half hour of Endgame was basically just one crowd-pleasing money shot after another. Sure, it might have been a little pandering, these sequences made Endgame feel like a fantastic close to this saga of MCU movies. This missable line of dialogue is a lot of fun because it mocks one of the most obvious habits the MCU films fall into. Number 4. Storage Locker 616. Between the events of Ant-Man and the Wasp and the 5-year time skip in Endgame, the van Scott Lang used to travel to the quantum realm in has been moved to a storage locker. When a rat scurries across the control panel of the van, the equipment activates and Ant-Man was freed from his imprisonment. However, to him, the previous 5 years passed in a matter of 5 hours. There are actually a couple of smaller Easter eggs in this scene, with one of the most obvious being the locker itself. Lang's belongings are kept in Storage Locker 616, which is a reference to the main universe in the Marvel Comics. The Marvel Multiverse is a long-standing part of comics, and most of the mainline heroes live in the universe number 616. Although the idea of a multiple universe hasn't appeared in the Marvel Cinematic Universe quite yet, it seems like it might play a role in Spider-Man Far From Home. Then again, Mysterio is the one making these claims, and his whole shtick in the comics is that he's a con man who tricks people into thinking he's magic. Still, this reference is a fun wink to comic fans and nice acknowledgement of the source material. Number 5. Jarvis leaped from TV to film. It didn't take long for the MCU to reveal that Tony Stark's helpful AI companion Jarvis was named after his father's butler. Although the AI is voiced by Paul Bettany, the same actor who would go on to play the Vision, the human character is portrayed by James Darcy. Even though the human Jarvis has been a part of the MCU for years, Endgame was actually the character's first film appearance. Edwin Jarvis primarily appeared in the Agent Carter television series. He aided both Peggy Carter and Howard Stark in their efforts to covertly combat Hydra forces. Although we don't ever see him interact with a young Tony Stark, we can assume that he left an impression on the inventor as Tony named his computer assistant after him. What's really cool about Jarvis' appearance in Endgame though, is that this makes Darcy the first to portray a character in an MCU show and then play that character in a film. The Marvel shows really helped to expand the franchise in its early years and really made it feel like a massive and interconnected project. Seeing a character from a show finally appear in a Marvel movie only adds to that feeling. It's also appropriate that this would happen in Endgame, which is more or less a celebration of the MCU up until this point. Number 6. The Starks and Cheeseburgers. One of the first really good jokes in the MCU, and one that sets the tone for the franchise's humor going forward, is Tony Stark's insistence that he eats a cheeseburger after escaping from terrorists. While many moviegoers thought this was just going to be a one-off line in the first Iron Man movie, many were delighted to see Tony eat a Whopper in the very next scene. These kinds of quips and unexpected follow-throughs would become a major component in the writing of Marvel movies. Endgame features a strangely touching tribute to this joke. During Tony Stark's funeral, his daughter Morgan says that she wants cheeseburgers when Happy asks if she's hungry. This causes Jon Favreau's character to tear up, as he replies that her dad liked cheeseburgers too, and that he's going to get her as many as she can eat. The meaning behind this scene probably went over your head if you didn't catch the first Iron Man movie, but it's still pretty heartfelt. It also helps make the movie feel like even more of a celebration of all of the great stuff in the past installments of the MCU. It's a strange reference and maybe feels a little too much like Marvel patting itself on the back, but it's still a fantastic callback that manages to be both funny and sweet. Number 7. The Terminal Beach Easter Egg. The other big reference in the scene where Ant-Man escapes from the quantum realm centers on the book read by Ken Jeong's character. The Terminal Beach is a collection of short science fiction stories written by J.G. Ballard in 1964. Notably, this book contains a short story called Endgame with a hyphen between end and game. This Endgame story focuses on a death row prisoner living in a comfortable house with his executioner. The prisoner doesn't know how or when the executioner will try to dispose of him, and the two pass time by playing a game of chess. All the while, the prisoner is trying to convince the executioner to let him go. It's certainly an interesting story, and somehow darker than a film bearing the same name that involves half of all life being decimated. This Easter egg is just plain fun, and would have only made sense to a handful of sci-fi buffs watching Avengers Endgame for the first time. It also makes you wonder if there were any hidden nods to the Doctor Who and Batman Endgame stories. If those references are in the movie, we haven't found them yet, but they could just be exceptionally well hidden. Number 8. Captain Marvel's comic book haircut. Avengers Endgame actually does a couple of surprising things with the hairstyles of some of its characters. We covered in a previous video how the trailers hid Black Widow's cool two-tone look, but there's a lot going on with Captain Marvel's new do as well. Following the 5-year time skip, Brie Larson's Carol Danvers got a pretty radical trim. Not quite a pixie cut, but still rather short and bold. Captain Marvel's new hairstyle is clearly inspired by her comic book counterpart. The history of Carol Danvers in Marvel Comics is pretty bizarre, even by comic book standards. The short version is that during a franchise crossover event, the original Captain Marvel, a Kree alien named Mar-Vell, sacrificed himself to save the world. Before that though, he passed on the title of Captain Marvel to Carol, who up until that point had been known as Miss Marvel. Always having been a more popular character than her male counterpart, this transfer had Carol don a less sexualized costume and switched to a much shorter hairstyle. As such, Captain Marvel's shorter hair became heavily associated with female empowerment and equality. As the MCU's Captain Marvel represents similar values, it makes sense for her to have a similar and equally cool hairstyle. Number 9. Tony's daughter is named after another Marvel character. Tony Stark and Pepper Potts, portrayed by Gwyneth Paltrow, have a daughter in Avengers Endgame. Portrayed by Lexi Rabe, Morgan is pretty influential in Tony deciding to go through with Operation Time Heist. However, readers of the Iron Man comics will know that there's another Stark with the same name. In the Marvel Comics, Morgan Stark is Tony's cousin, with Tony Stark's uncle having sold off all of the shares to Stark Industries to Howard Stark. Morgan missed out on acquiring a vast fortune and is resentful of that. He feels like Tony is undeserving of his wealth and schemes to take it away from him by teaming up with other villains. Morgan isn't one of Iron Man's best villains, although that's a pretty shallow pool to begin with. It's still pretty fun how the movie is repurposing the name and connecting it to a character that's much more meaningful to Tony Stark's character growth. His daughter put a lot of things in perspective for Tony, and Morgan made him far more self-sacrificing than ever before. The MCU Morgan Stark is a way better character than the comic book Morgan Stark. Even if it means we never see Tony's shady cousin in the MCU, repurposing the Morgan Stark name was the right decision. 10. A PlayStation 4 appeared because of Spider-Man. Following the time skip, Mark Ruffalo's Professor Hulk and Bradley Cooper's Rocket Raccoon reunite with Chris Hemsworth's Thor. In the same scene where we learn that the God of Thunder has fallen into a pretty nasty funk, we see Korg playing Fortnite. While this does make you wonder how Fortnite's Thanos mode plays in the characters in the MCU, it's also clear that Korg is playing the game using a PlayStation 4 controller. While Fortnite is available on every major gaming system, it's likely that this scene had to have a PlayStation because of Sony's ownership of Spider-Man. Back in the 90s, Marvel sold Spider-Man's movie and video game rights to Sony, before the company was acquired by Disney. That's why the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies premiered years before the launch of the MCU, and why 2018's Spider-Man game was a PlayStation 4 exclusive. Although Disney and Sony Pictures have reached an agreement that lets Spider-Man characters and movies appear in the MCU, things are still pretty tense between the businesses. Even if there's no formal agreement stating that game consoles and the MCU movies have to be Sony PlayStation, Disney definitely wants to be on good terms with Sony. Even this small bit of free advertising was likely carefully considered and is indicative of how massive and complicated the business side of the MCU really is. Please let us know if you caught any references or Easter eggs that we missed in the comments section down below. While you're there, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the Avenger. We have tons of great Marvel-focused videos coming soon, so click on that bell icon if you want to make sure you don't miss a single one of them.